6:30 in the morning. A tow truck rolled up to my driveway. Neighbors peeked through their blinds. I stepped outside in my bathrobe, coffee in hand. The HOA president smiled like she'd already won. 2 patrol cars pulled up behind the tow truck. Her smile started to shrink the moment the doors opened. What happened next? Nobody in Cedar Hollow ever forgot. My name is Marcus Doyle, 44 years old, married to Elena for 18 years, father to a 16-year-old daughter named Sophie. We'd lived in Cedar Hollow Estates for 6 years, a quiet gated community where I mostly kept to myself and let my work stay at work. In my garage sat a 1969 Mustang fastback, cherry red, the last thing my father restored before he passed. I wasn't showy about it. I drove it twice a month, kept it covered the rest of the time, and treated it like a piece of him still breathing. Deborah Kessler had been HOA president for 3 years running unopposed, mostly because nobody else wanted the headache of dealing with her. She ran board meetings like courtroom hearings, quoted bylaws from memory, and treated every rule violation as a personal insult against her authority. Her son Tyler was 22, drove a modified Camaro too fast through our streets, and somehow never got a single violation notice despite 3 noise complaints filed by other residents. Deborah handled those complaints herself, filing them in a drawer instead of the official log. I first crossed her when Sophie's bicycle sat in our driveway for an afternoon. Deborah left a citation on our door citing unauthorized outdoor storage of recreational equipment, a bylaw so obscure I had to look it up to confirm it existed. I paid the small fine without arguing, figuring it wasn't worth the fight. Elena warned me that giving in the first time only invited more. She dealt with Deborah before I moved in, back when Deborah fined her for hanging a wreath 2 days early. Word around the neighborhood was that Deborah's late husband left her the house and a modest inheritance, and running the HOA gave her something that felt like power again. Neighbors whispered she'd once had a real career, though nobody could say exactly what she used to do. What people did know was that Tyler had wrecked his own Camaro 3 weeks earlier. Some story about clipping a guardrail on Route 9 late at night. Deborah told everyone he swerved for a deer. The body shop estimate, according to gossip, came back at $11,000. I noticed Deborah's eyes lingering on my Mustang the day I washed it in the driveway. She walked over, ran a hand along the fender without asking, and said it was wasted on someone who barely drives it. I laughed it off. She didn't laugh with me. A week later, a new citation appeared on my door, vehicle exceeding permitted display duration in driveway. I'd washed the car for 40 minutes. The bylaw, as written, allowed 2 hours. I photographed the notice, confused more than angry, and let it go again. Elena wasn't as forgiving. She pulled up the HOA bylaws online and found no such rule existed in the current version, only in an outdated draft from a decade earlier. When she brought it to the board, Deborah claimed it was simply an oversight in updating the website. My neighbor Walt Ferris, a retired homicide detective in his 70s, caught me raking leaves and mentioned, almost offhand, that Deborah's fines seemed to spike whenever she wanted something. He'd watched her push out 2 other families over disputes that started exactly this way. Walt had a theory nobody wanted to hear, that Deborah didn't find people to enforce rules. She fined people to soften them up before making an offer. She wants something from you, Marcus, he said. Watch how fast the offer comes after this. Sure enough, 3 days later, Deborah knocked on my door holding a folder of paperwork. She smiled too widely and said Tyler needed a reliable car for his new job, and she'd hate for me to keep dealing with citations over an unnecessary luxury vehicle. She offered $4,000 for the Mustang, roughly a tenth of what it was worth even in rough shape, let alone fully restored. I told her, as politely as I could manage, that it wasn't for sale. Her smile didn't move, but her eyes did. "Everything's for sale at the right price," she said, folding her paperwork closed. "Or the right pressure." I assumed she meant more fines. I didn't yet understand how far she was willing to go, or how personally she'd already decided to take my refusal. Sophie mentioned that Tyler had been driving slowly past our house some evenings, staring at the garage like he was measuring it. I told her not to worry, that it was probably nothing, though something about it sat wrong with me long after she went to bed. At the next HOA meeting, Deborah brought up unregistered classic vehicles posing insurance liabilities as a new agenda item, clearly aimed at me, though she never said my name. Two board members exchanged glances. Nobody seconded the motion to draft new restrictions, and it quietly died. Deborah cornered me in the parking lot afterward and said she was disappointed I hadn't reconsidered her offer. She mentioned, almost casually, that towing violations for improperly stored vehicles could result in impound regardless of registration status. I said the car was registered and insured, fully compliant. "Compliance is a matter of interpretation," she said, and walked off before I could respond. Walt, standing nearby, muttered that he'd heard her use that exact phrase before, right before she'd had another neighbor's boat trailer towed off a technicality that later got overturned. I started keeping copies of every citation, every email, every notice Deborah sent, storing them in a folder on my laptop labeled simply HOA. Elena thought I was being paranoid. I told her I'd rather have paperwork I never needed than need paperwork I didn't have. None of us knew yet that Deborah had already made a call to the towing company, or that she'd started drafting a report claiming my Mustang was an abandoned, non-operational vehicle left unattended for over 30 days, a claim that wasn't true by any measure. The report Deborah filed landed on the desk of the county's code enforcement office, listing my address, describing the Mustang as inoperable, and requesting authorization for removal under the abandoned vehicle ordinance. She signed it as HOA president, giving it a weight it hadn't earned. I found out about the filing only because a clerk named Priya, who happened to be a friend of Elena's from her book club, called to ask why an obviously registered and insured vehicle was flagged for impound. Elena thanked her and hung up, hands shaking with anger. "She's trying to have your car seized through the county," Elena said, sliding her phone across the table. I read the filing twice, and both times landed on the same word, abandoned. My car had been driven to the grocery store 4 days earlier. I drove down to code enforcement myself and showed them the registration, the insurance card, and a photo time-stamped from that grocery run. The clerk apologized for the confusion and flagged the file as disputed, but admitted the tow order hadn't been formally canceled yet. Deborah, when confronted at the mailbox by Walt, denied knowing anything about a county filing, claiming she'd only submitted a routine inquiry about vehicle status in the neighborhood. Walt didn't believe her, and neither did I, but neither of us had proof strong enough to push further yet. That night, Elena asked me the question I'd been avoiding answering out loud. Why didn't I just tell Deborah who I actually was? I hadn't hidden it exactly, but I also hadn't advertised it, preferring to be Marcus the neighbor rather than Marcus the police chief. Because it shouldn't matter, I told her. Rules should apply the same whether I'm the chief or the mailman. The second I use the title to make problems disappear, I've become exactly the kind of person who abuses power, same as she is. Elena didn't fully agree, but she respected it enough not to push. What neither of us realized was that Deborah genuinely didn't know my job title. My cruiser stayed at the department garage. I commuted in an unmarked sedan, and I'd simply never mentioned it at HOA events. 2 days after the code enforcement visit, a new letter arrived, this time from Deborah directly, citing failure to comply with HOA vehicle guidelines and warning of further enforcement action if I didn't resolve the matter. I read it standing in my driveway, jaw tight. I called the HOA's management company, a small firm that technically oversaw Deborah's board, and asked to see the actual bylaw she kept citing. The representative, sounding uncomfortable, admitted the language Deborah used didn't match anything in their official governing documents on file. She may be referencing an old proposed draft that never passed a vote, the rep said carefully. When I asked why she'd cite unofficial language in a formal enforcement letter, the rep had no answer, only a promise to look into it internally. Word had started spreading through the neighborhood by then. A few residents privately told Elena they'd had similar run-ins with Deborah over the years, usually resolved by paying a fine or simply giving in to whatever she wanted, just to make the harassment stop. One neighbor, an older woman named Carol, said Deborah once had her garden gnomes removed by force after Deborah declared them visual clutter, a term that appeared nowhere in the bylaws either. Carol never fought it. She just replaced the gnomes with plain shrubs and moved on. Hearing that story lit something in me that hadn't fully caught fire before. This wasn't really about a car. It was about a pattern. One where a person with a little borrowed authority decided her preferences were law, and nobody had ever made her answer for it. Walt offered to help. He still had contacts at the county records office and knew how to properly file a public records request. He suggested we pull every HOA financial disclosure and enforcement filing Deborah had submitted over her 3 years as president. People like her get away with it because nobody bothers checking, Walt said, pouring 2 cups of coffee at his kitchen table. The second you start checking, they either back off or they panic and make a mistake. Either way, you win. I hesitated. This could resolve itself with one honest conversation. Elena reminded me, gently, that I'd already tried that conversation, twice, and both times Deborah had responded with more paperwork instead of less. Sometimes people show you exactly who they are. We filed the records request that Friday. It would take 2 to 3 weeks to process. The clerk warned us. Longer if the HOA's management company was slow to respond. I told Walt that was fine. I wasn't going anywhere, and neither was my Mustang. That weekend, I noticed Tyler's Camaro parked outside Deborah's house with a fresh dent on the rear bumper that hadn't been there before, alongside the older damage still unrepaired from his earlier accident. Sophie mentioned she'd heard tires screeching 2 streets over the same night. I didn't think much of it at the time. It would be weeks before I understood exactly what that screeching sound had actually meant, or how directly it connected to the county filing that had already put my Mustang in Deborah's crosshairs. The following Monday, a second tow order appeared, this one more aggressive in tone, citing repeated noncompliance, despite the fact that I'd resolved the county's confusion in person. I called code enforcement again, and the same clerk confirmed the order should have been closed. Someone reopened it, the clerk told me, sounding genuinely puzzled. I don't have authorization on file for that. I'll flag it for a supervisor. I thanked her and hung up, feeling the ground shift slightly under a situation I'd assumed was already resolved. Elena suggested we install a doorbell camera, something we talked about for months but never gotten around to. Within a day of installing it, we captured Deborah herself walking up our driveway at dusk, taking photos of the Mustang under its cover without ever knocking. When I brought the footage up at the next HOA meeting, Deborah claimed she was simply documenting compliance for the file, a courtesy she said she extended to every resident under review. No other resident in the room could recall her ever doing the same for them. Carol, sitting 2 rows back, spoke up for the first time in years, saying Deborah had never once photographed her property. Even during the gnome dispute, a ripple of quiet agreement moved through the room. Deborah's jaw tightened, though her voice stayed perfectly composed. I don't answer to gossip, she said, adjourning the meeting early before anyone could press further. Walt caught my eye from across the room and gave a small nod, the kind that said we're getting somewhere, even if it didn't feel that way yet. That night, Deborah sent an email to the entire HOA distribution list, warning residents about increasing disregard for community standards and hinting, without naming me directly, that certain households were testing the board's patience. Several neighbors forwarded it to me, confused about who she meant. I didn't respond publicly. Instead, I forwarded the email to Walt with a single line. She's escalating. Walt replied within minutes, telling me the records request would likely come back showing exactly why she needed to escalate so badly, and to be patient a little longer. Sophie came home from a friend's house upset, saying Tyler had made a comment to her at the community pool about how that old car won't be in your garage much longer. She hadn't told him where she lived, which meant Deborah had told her son our address. Elena wanted to file a formal complaint against Deborah with the management company over Tyler's comment to our daughter. I agreed, though privately I suspected the management company had little real power over an HOA president who'd learned exactly how far she could push before facing consequences. The complaint went in that week, along with copies of the doorbell footage and the mismatched tow orders. The management company promised a review within 30 days, a timeline that felt almost designed to outlast whatever Deborah was planning to do with my Mustang. Walt's public records request finally started trickling back in pieces. The HOA's financial disclosures showed a reserve fund that had shrunk by nearly $40,000 over 2 years, with vague line items labeled community improvements that no resident could recall ever seeing completed. No new landscaping, no repaved roads, no clubhouse repairs, Walt said, spreading printed pages across his kitchen table. 40 grand vanished, and Deborah's the only signature on every withdrawal. I stared at the numbers, understanding for the first time how much bigger this actually was. Elena asked the obvious question. Could this be why Deborah wanted my Mustang so badly? Not for Tyler's sake, but because she needed something valuable to quietly liquidate before anyone noticed the missing funds. Walt thought it was possible, though we still lacked hard proof. We decided not to confront Deborah directly yet. Tipping our hand too early could give her time to shred records or shift blame onto the management company. Walt suggested patience, gathering everything quietly first, then presenting it all at once where she couldn't spin her way out. A week later, a third notice arrived, this time threatening a lien on my property itself if the unresolved vehicle violation wasn't addressed within 10 business days. I'd never heard of an HOA placing a lien over a parked car, and neither had my attorney. My attorney, a calm woman named Renata who'd handled a property dispute for us years earlier, reviewed the notice and called it legally shaky at best, noting that liens typically required a documented, voted upon violation process that Deborah clearly hadn't followed with any of her filings. Renata offered to send a formal cease and desist letter, warning that continued harassment could expose Deborah personally to liability, separate from the HOA itself. I authorized it immediately, relieved to finally have someone with legal weight pushing back instead of just paperwork and patience. Deborah's response came fast. She called an emergency board meeting, framing it as an urgent discussion about vehicle safety concerns in the community, though everyone who attended understood exactly whose vehicle she meant, and exactly who she was trying to pressure into public agreement. At the meeting, Deborah presented photos of my Mustang, cherry-picked to make it look neglected, ignoring that the car ran perfectly and passed inspection every year. Carol interrupted to ask why a functioning, insured vehicle needed an emergency meeting at all, and Deborah had no clean answer. One board member, a quiet man named Frank who rarely spoke, asked to see documentation of the actual bylaw being enforced. Deborah promised to circulate it after the meeting. She never did. Frank made a note of that in the official minutes. Unprompted, for the first time, walking out that night, Walt told me something had shifted in the room. People weren't nodding along with Deborah the way they used to. Small cracks were forming, not because of anything dramatic, but because people had simply started asking questions instead of quietly complying. Deborah must have sensed it too, because 2 days later she filed for the lien anyway, ignoring both Renata's cease and desist and the board's own lack of formal vote. The county recorder's office accepted it on a technicality, since HOA filings rarely got deep scrutiny. Renata was furious when she found out, calling it borderline fraudulent, and immediately began preparing paperwork to challenge the lien in court, a process that could take weeks but would almost certainly succeed given how thin Deborah's justification actually was on paper. Elena asked me directly, for the first time, whether it was finally time to tell people who I actually did for a living. I still resisted, not out of stubbornness, but because I wanted this fight won on facts and law, not on the weight of a badge. If it comes out because it's true and it's relevant, I told her. Not because I need it as a weapon. Elena squeezed my hand and said she understood, though I could tell part of her wished I'd just end it faster. Sophie, meanwhile, had quietly started keeping her own notes, writing down every time Tyler said something odd or threatening near the pool or the mailboxes. She showed me a small notebook one evening, dates and quotes carefully recorded, more organized than I expected from a 16-year-old. "You taught me that," she said when I asked where she'd learned to document things that way. I hadn't realized she'd been paying that much attention to how I worked, and something about that moment made the whole fight feel worth fighting even more than before. The lien challenge went to a preliminary hearing faster than expected, thanks to Renata's aggressive filing. The judge, reviewing Deborah's paperwork, noted openly that the HOA had failed to follow its own documented process and set a follow-up hearing to formally void the lien. Deborah left the courthouse that day without speaking to anyone, climbing straight into her car. Walt, watching from across the parking lot, said her hands were shaking on the wheel, the first real crack we'd seen in her composure since this whole thing started months earlier. For a few weeks, Things went quiet. No new citations arrived. No emergency meetings got called. Elena wondered aloud if Deborah had finally given up. Chastened by the courthouse loss and the mounting scrutiny from Frank and Carol and the rest of the board, I didn't believe it for a second. People like Deborah rarely retreat quietly. Walt reminded me one evening on his porch. Quiet usually meant regrouping, not surrendering, and he'd seen enough cases in his career to know the difference between the two almost instinctively. Sophie's junior year picked up pace with midterms, and for a while our house felt almost normal again. Dinners without HOA letters on the counter. Weekends without checking the mailbox with dread. Even Elena admitted the calm felt nice, even if neither of us fully trusted it. The county records request Walt filed months earlier finally completed processing, delivering a thick stack of documents that included bank statements, board meeting minutes, and vendor invoices going back 3 full years. Far more detail than the earlier disclosures Deborah had reluctantly shared. Walt spent an entire weekend cross-referencing invoices against actual work performed in the neighborhood. Several vendor names appeared repeatedly for jobs nobody could remember happening. Landscaping companies that no resident had ever seen a truck from. Repair crews for a clubhouse roof that looked untouched. One invoice stood out immediately. A $15,000 payment to a company called Kessler Property Solutions, which Walt discovered, after a quick search, was registered to Deborah's maiden name at an address matching her own house. A company with no other clients or public presence whatsoever. She's been paying herself, Walt said, sliding the invoice across his kitchen table. Through a shell company. For work that was never done. I stared at the paper for a long moment, finally understanding the true shape of what we'd been dealing with all along. Elena wanted to go straight to the police, but I reminded her, carefully, that this needed to go through the proper channels. County fraud investigators rather than local patrol, and that rushing it could give Deborah room to destroy records before anyone could act on them. I made a discreet call to a friend in the county's financial crimes unit, someone I trusted to handle it professionally without word leaking back to Deborah prematurely. He agreed to review the documents quietly and let us know whether there was enough for a formal investigation. 2 days later, he called back, sounding genuinely impressed by how thorough Walt's cross-referencing had been. "This isn't just suspicious," he said. "This looks like a clean embezzlement case. Assuming the shell company checks out the way your documents suggest it does, the investigation would take time to formalize properly," he warned. "Likely another few weeks before any real action could happen." I understood the frustration of waiting, but I also understood the value of building something airtight instead of something Deborah could wriggle out of later. What none of us anticipated was that the quiet period was about to end violently, not because of the embezzlement investigation, but because Deborah had apparently decided, in the silence, that softer tactics had failed and it was time to escalate far beyond paperwork entirely. It started with a knock at 7 in the morning, sharper and more insistent than any mail carrier. I opened the door to find a tow truck idling in the street and a man in a company polo holding a clipboard with my address circled in red. "Got an order to remove a non-compliant vehicle from this property," he said, glancing past me toward the garage. I asked to see the authorization. He handed over a printed form with Deborah's signature on it, dated that morning, citing the very lien Renata had already challenged. I told him calmly that the lien was currently under legal dispute in county court and had not been finalized. He shrugged, saying he just went where the paperwork sent him, and that if I had a problem, I should take it up with whoever hired him. I called Renata immediately, standing in my driveway in a bathrobe while the tow operator waited by his truck. She confirmed the lien hadn't been legally activated and told me not to let the vehicle be touched, promising to fax an injunction notice within the hour. Deborah herself pulled up moments later in her SUV, stepping out with the same tight, satisfied smile she'd worn the very first day she sighted my daughter's bicycle. "This has gone on long enough, Marcus," she said. "The car needs to be surrendered today." "There's no valid lien," I told her, keeping my voice level despite the anger tightening my chest. "You know that." I already flagged it as unenforceable. Deborah waved a hand like the courthouse itself was an inconvenience she'd simply decided to ignore. "Judges make mistakes," she said. "I have a signed order and a tow company ready to work. Unless you'd like to explain to your neighbors why you think you're above HOA rules, I suggest you step aside and let this happen the easy way." Neighbors had started gathering on their lawns by then, drawn by the tow truck's flashing lights. Carol stood on her porch with her arms crossed. Frank watched silently from his driveway. Walt walked over slowly, phone already raised, recording everything without saying a word. "I'm not stepping aside," I said. "You're welcome to call the police if you think this is legal. I'd love for an officer to review that paperwork." Deborah's smile flickered, just barely, but she pulled out her phone and dialed, apparently confident it would go her way. Within 10 minutes, 2 patrol cars turned onto our street, lights flashing but no sirens. Deborah straightened up, visibly pleased, clearly expecting the uniforms to side with her paperwork the way most people assumed uniforms automatically would when a homeowner association waved something official-looking. The first officer to step out was a young woman I recognized instantly, Officer Reyes, one of the newer hires I'd personally approved during last year's Academy graduation review. Her eyes met mine for half a second before her expression shifted from routine to genuinely startled. "Chief Doyle," she said, loud enough for half the street to hear. The word chief landed in the yard like a dropped glass. Deborah's confident posture stiffened. Several neighbors turned to look at me with expressions somewhere between confusion and dawning realization all at once. "Morning, Reyes," I said, keeping my tone as calm as I could manage despite the moment. "Sorry you got called out for this. I think there's some confusion about a tow order that shouldn't have been issued in the first place." Reyes straightened instinctively. Her partner, an older officer named Dabrowski who'd worked under me for nearly a decade, walked over and, without thinking twice about it, gave a crisp, automatic salute before catching himself with an awkward half-laugh. "Sorry, Chief." "Reflex," he said. "Didn't expect to see you out here." The word chief rippled through the small crowd a second time. Louder this time, carried neighbor to neighbor like a spark catching dry grass. Deborah's mouth opened slightly, no sound coming out at first, her eyes darting between the officers and the man she'd been trying to find for months. "You're the police chief," she said finally. More statement than question, her voice noticeably thinner than it had been minutes earlier. "You never mentioned that." I shrugged. "You never asked." "Shouldn't matter. Rules should apply the same either way, don't you think?" Reyes asked to see the paperwork Deborah had been waving around, reviewing it with the practiced skepticism of someone who'd been trained to spot inconsistencies. She flipped to the lien reference number, then pulled out her own tablet to cross-check it against the county filing system. This lien shows a legal challenge filed against it 2 weeks ago, Reyes said. Status here reads pending. Not active. You can't legally tow a vehicle off a disputed lien. Ma'am. Deborah's jaw tightened, her earlier confidence visibly draining from her posture with every word. There's clearly been a miscommunication, Deborah said, attempting to recover some composure. I was told the lien had cleared. Reyes glanced at the timestamp on the paperwork, then at Deborah, then back at the tow operator, who suddenly looked very interested in his own boots. Ma'am, this document is dated this morning, Reyes said. Same day you called the tow company. If there was a miscommunication, it happened on your end, not the county's. The tow operator quietly climbed back into his truck without waiting to be told. Clearly done arguing, Deborah turned to me, softer now, almost pleading. Marcus, surely we can handle this privately, between neighbors. I told her, evenly, that I had no interest in handling documented harassment, embezzlement suspicions, and an unauthorized tow attempt privately, and that everything from here would go through proper channels. The word embezzlement landed harder than chief had. Several neighbors visibly startled. Deborah's face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the morning chill, her eyes flicking toward Walt, who simply lowered his phone and gave her a small, knowing nod. I don't know what you're talking about, Deborah said, though her voice cracked slightly on the last word. The first real crack in her composure the entire neighborhood had ever witnessed in 3 years of watching her run meetings like a courtroom she always won in. Officer Dabrowski cleared his throat and suggested, professionally, that this had clearly escalated beyond a simple parking dispute and recommended everyone involved cooperate with any formal county investigation rather than continuing to argue paperwork on a residential lawn in front of half the block. Deborah straightened her jacket, forced a tight smile, and said she'd look forward to clearing this up through proper channels, before retreating toward her SUV with far less confidence than she'd arrived with. Nobody on the street believed for a second that she meant it calmly. As she pulled away, Carol walked over and squeezed my arm. Chief, she said, testing the word like she was trying it on for the first time. Well, that explains a few things. I laughed despite myself, exhausted, relieved, and still furious all at once. Reyes apologized again before leaving, saying she genuinely hadn't known the address belonged to me when the call came in. I told her there was nothing to apologize for, that she'd done exactly what good officers should do. Checked the paperwork instead of just following orders blindly. Walt showed me the video he'd recorded. The whole exchange captured clean and clear. Deborah's shifting excuses, the officer's salute, the tow truck retreating. This, he said, is the kind of evidence that ends careers when it lands in front of the right people. That evening, the county financial crimes contact called again, saying the embezzlement review had been expedited after receiving an anonymous tip earlier that day. One that apparently included details about a shell company nobody outside our small circle should have known about yet. I hadn't leaked anything, and neither had Walt. We eventually learned Frank, the quiet board member, had grown suspicious enough on his own to pull invoice records independently and had submitted his own tip weeks earlier. Unaware Walt was already building a nearly identical case. Guess I wasn't the only one paying attention, Walt said with a dry laugh when we found out. 2 separate people, working independently, had reached the same conclusion about Deborah's finances. which only made the case against her stronger once investigators combined both threads of evidence. Deborah, unaware how far the investigation had already progressed, sent an email that night to the HOA distribution list attempting to spin the morning's events,
claiming a misunderstanding regarding vehicle compliance was resolved amicably.
Nobody who'd stood on that lawn believed a word of it. Several residents replied all, something almost unheard of on that email chain, asking pointed questions about the lien, the tow order, and why the county's financial crimes unit had reportedly been in contact with the HOA. Deborah didn't respond to any of the replies. Instead, board member Frank quietly scheduled an emergency meeting of his own, something technically within his rights as a sitting board member, listing the sole agenda item as review of HOA financial records and leadership conduct. The meeting was set for the following week, giving Deborah just enough time to realize the walls were closing in from multiple directions at once. The courthouse, the financial crimes unit, her own board, and a neighborhood that had finally stopped taking her word at face value. Sophie asked me that night if we were safe, if Deborah or Tyler might try something worse now that they'd been publicly humiliated on our front lawn. I told her the truth, that people cornered sometimes act recklessly, and that we needed to stay alert without staying afraid. Elena suggested we upgrade our security setup beyond the doorbell camera, adding motion-activated lights around the garage and a second camera angled directly at the driveway. I agreed immediately, not out of paranoia this time, but because caution had already proven itself worth the trouble. 2 nights later, the motion lights caught something the doorbell camera missed entirely. Tyler, alone, walking slowly along the side of our garage around midnight, testing the side door handle before glancing around and retreating quickly when the floodlights snapped on above him. I called it in the next morning, not as chief pulling strings, but as a homeowner filing a legitimate trespassing report. Footage attached, timestamped clearly. Reyes took the report herself, professional and thorough, noting it would be added to the growing file already building against the Kessler household. Deborah, when questioned about her son's presence on my property that night, claimed Tyler had simply been out for a walk and may have wandered near the wrong house by mistake. An explanation that satisfied absolutely nobody, least of all the officer writing down her statement. Renata used the trespassing report to strengthen our position at the upcoming lien hearing, arguing that Deborah's escalating conduct, from unauthorized towing attempts to her son's nighttime property visits, demonstrated a clear pattern of harassment rather than isolated, unrelated incidents anyone could dismiss as coincidence. The judge, reviewing the expanded file at the follow-up hearing, didn't hesitate long. The lien was formally voided, ruled improperly filed from the outset, and the judge added a pointed comment on record about HOA boards weaponizing bylaws against individual homeowners without proper process. Deborah sat silently through the ruling. Her attorney, a young man clearly overwhelmed by how thin his client's paperwork actually was, offering little pushback. Walking out, she avoided eye contact with everyone, including the small cluster of Cedar Hollow residents who'd shown up simply to watch. Frank's emergency board meeting arrived the following Tuesday, packed with more residents than any HOA meeting in the community's history. Carol brought printed copies of old complaints going back years. Walt brought his financial cross-reference documents. I brought nothing but sat quietly in the third row. Frank opened by reading a summary of the shell company invoices, the $40,000 reserve fund shortfall, and the unauthorized lien, laying it all out in plain, careful language without ever raising his voice, letting the documented facts carry weight no accusation alone ever could. Deborah tried to interrupt twice, calling the presentation a coordinated smear campaign, but Frank simply continued reading directly from the financial records, numbers that didn't care how loudly anyone objected to them, numbers that matched exactly what the county's investigators had independently already confirmed. A motion was raised to suspend Deborah's presidency, pending the outcome of the county investigation, a motion that required a majority board vote to pass. Something that would have been unthinkable even a month earlier when Deborah still controlled every conversation in that room. The vote passed 4-1, Deborah herself casting the lone dissenting vote. The room stayed quiet for a long moment afterward. Not celebratory exactly, just heavy with the strange weight of watching someone lose a power they'd held onto so tightly for so long. Deborah stood, gathered her folder of papers, and walked out without another word, her heels echoing across the community center floor in a silence louder than any argument she'd ever won there before. None of us knew yet just how much further this would still go. In the days after the suspension, Deborah's public composure fully cracked. She began calling individual board members late at night, according to Frank, alternating between apologies and thinly veiled threats about consequences for anyone who continued cooperating with what she called a witch hunt. Carol received a call too, despite having no formal board authority, warning her to watch what she says publicly about the situation. An implicit threat that Carol reported directly to Reyes the next morning, adding one more document to the ever-growing file against Deborah. Tyler, meanwhile, started appearing at odd hours around the neighborhood again, this time parking his Camaro at the end of our street rather than driving past directly, sitting inside it for stretches of 10 or 15 minutes before leaving without ever approaching the house itself. Elena wanted to call the police every time it happened, but I explained that documenting the pattern first, without escalating unnecessarily, would build a stronger harassment case than a dozen individual complaints that might each get dismissed as minor or circumstantial on their own. The security footage compiled steadily, a folder growing heavier by the week, timestamps stacking evidence of a pattern no reasonable judge could later call coincidence. Walt reviewed each new clip with the same careful patience he'd once brought to decades of real investigations before retiring. Then came the night everything nearly went too far. Around 1 a.m, the motion lights snapped on again, and this time the camera caught Tyler approaching the garage directly, carrying what investigators later identified as a container of what appeared to be gasoline. I woke to the security app's alert, heart slamming, and moved fast, calling it in immediately while grabbing my phone to check the live feed. Tyler froze under the floodlights, clearly startled by how bright they were, glancing toward the street before backing away in a hurry. By the time patrol arrived 4 minutes later, Tyler was gone, but the footage remained, unmistakable and damning, time-stamped and geotagged, showing a young man approaching a private garage in the middle of the night carrying a container of accelerant near a residence he had no reason to be at. Reyes arrived personally this time, off-duty but responding anyway once she heard the address over dispatch. Standing in my driveway reviewing the footage with an expression that had shifted entirely from the polite professionalism of our first encounter to something far more serious and focused. "This isn't a parking dispute anymore," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "This is attempted arson." The word landed heavy in the dark driveway, confirming a fear I'd been quietly carrying since the first citation over Sophie's bicycle months earlier without ever saying it aloud. Tyler was picked up within the hour, found still in his Camaro 2 streets over, the gas container still in his trunk. He denied everything at first, claiming he'd simply been out driving, until the time-stamped, geotagged footage was played back for him in the patrol car. Deborah arrived at the station before dawn, frantic, demanding to see her son, insisting there had to be some kind of mistake, a phrase she'd used so many times over the past months that it had started to feel less like an excuse and more like a reflex. Detective Ana Ruiz, assigned to the case given its now serious nature, informed Deborah calmly that the footage was clear, the intent was documented, and that Tyler would be facing charges regardless of how many times his mother repeated the word mistake in the waiting room. It was during that same waiting room conversation, according to Ruiz's later report, that Deborah let something slip in her panic, mentioning offhand that Tyler had already had one accident this year. "We can't afford another mess," a comment Ruiz found curiously specific and flagged immediately. Ruiz pulled the earlier accident report Deborah had referenced, the one everyone assumed involved Tyler clipping a guardrail on Route 9. The actual county incident log told a different story entirely, one that had nothing to do with any guardrail, and everything to do with someone else's car. The report showed a hit-and-run collision on Route 9 the same night Tyler's Camaro sustained damage, involving a cyclist who'd been struck and left with a fractured leg. The driver fleeing the scene before witnesses could get a clear plate number in the dark, foggy conditions. Ruiz compared the damage described in the cyclist's case file against photos of Tyler's Camaro that Walt had inadvertently captured weeks earlier while documenting the neighborhood pattern. And the match was immediate. The same dented bumper, the same scraped paint along the same damaged panel. Confronted with the comparison, Tyler eventually admitted, quietly and without his mother present, that he had struck the cyclist that night and panicked, driving home instead of stopping, and that his mother had helped him fabricate the guardrail story to keep the truth from ever surfacing. It turned out Deborah's obsession with acquiring my Mustang hadn't only been about status or spite. Tyler's Camaro needed extensive, expensive, and traceable repairs that would have raised uncomfortable questions if handled through normal insurance channels, given the ongoing hit-and-run investigation quietly building in the background. A replacement vehicle, acquired quietly through what Deborah likely intended as a lowball private sale, would have let Tyler simply abandon the damaged Camaro entirely, erasing the evidence before anyone connected it to the cyclist's case. All while Deborah used HOA authority to force the sale. When the pieces came together, Ruiz sat back in her chair and told me later that this was one of the strangest cases she'd worked in years. An HOA parking dispute unraveling into embezzlement, attempted arson, and a concealed hit and run, all rooted in one woman's need for control. Deborah was arrested that same morning on obstruction charges related to the hit-and-run cover-up, in addition to the mounting embezzlement case already. Building from Walt and Frank's independent financial reviews, charges that would only grow heavier as investigators dug further into her HOA-era paperwork. News moved through Cedar Hollow fast, the way it always does in small communities. Neighbors gathering in driveways and group chats lighting up with a mixture of shock, vindication, and the particular satisfaction of watching someone who'd terrorized them for years finally face real consequences. Carol, who'd lost her garden gnomes to Deborah's arbitrary rulings years earlier, told Elena she felt almost dizzy hearing the news, like something she'd quietly accepted as simply how things were had suddenly been proven wrong in the most dramatic way imaginable. All at once. Frank, still technically the HOA's acting president after the earlier suspension vote, called another meeting, this one shorter, formally removing Deborah from the board entirely and beginning the process of appointing new leadership, with Carol nominated almost unanimously to help steady the transition. The cyclist Tyler had struck. A delivery worker named Marcus Webb, coincidentally sharing my first name, had been struggling for months with mounting medical bills and no leads on who'd hit him. Learning the case had finally broken open brought him, according to Ruiz, to tears in her office. Renata reached out to Webb's attorney directly, offering whatever documentation from our case might help strengthen his civil claim against Tyler and, by extension, Deborah, given her role in helping conceal the accident rather than reporting it the night it actually happened months earlier. Elena and I visited Webb once, briefly, mostly to make sure he knew the community stood behind him rather than behind the family that had hurt him and then hidden it for months. He thanked us quietly, saying he'd mostly just wanted someone to believe him. Tyler, facing charges for both the hit and run and the attempted arson at our garage, accepted a plea agreement weeks later that included restitution to Webb, mandatory community service, and a lengthy probation period, avoiding trial but not avoiding the consequences of everything he'd done. Deborah's case moved slower, prosecutors building a methodical embezzlement charge alongside the obstruction count, using Walt's meticulous invoice cross-referencing, almost entirely as the financial backbone of their case. A level of documentation the county's own auditors later called unusually thorough for a civilian complaint. Guess 30 years on the force wasn't completely wasted, Walt said with a tired laugh when the lead prosecutor thanked him personally for the clarity of his records. Records that had turned a messy, sprawling case into something clean enough to build airtight charges around. Reyes stopped by our house one evening, off duty, just to check in, admitting she still thought about that first morning on our lawn often. The salute, the shock on Deborah's face, the way the whole neighborhood's understanding of the situation flipped in under a minute. "I've never seen someone's confidence collapse that fast," she said. I told her it wasn't really about me being chief. Not fundamentally. It was about someone finally being forced to follow the same rules and paperwork she'd been weaponizing against everyone else for years. By late fall, Deborah's house sat with a for sale sign in the yard, the family having quietly relocated before her formal trial date, though the charges followed regardless of address. Prosecutors confirming the case would proceed whether or not she remained a Cedar Hollow resident. The weeks leading into the actual trial felt strange. Quieter than the chaos of the summer, but heavier somehow. Every conversation in the neighborhood eventually circling back to Deborah, to Tyler, to the slow unraveling of a woman who'd once controlled every bylaw in Cedar Hollow. Renata prepared me for the possibility of testifying, walking through what questions the defense might ask, particularly around the timeline of citations, the doorbell footage, and the arson attempt, making sure every piece of evidence I might reference stayed precise and unshakable under pressure. Elena worried more than she let on, mentioning once, quietly, that she hadn't fully exhaled since the gasoline container appeared on our security footage, and that some part of her wouldn't feel safe again until Deborah and Tyler were both formally, permanently held accountable in court. Sophie asked to attend the trial, insisting she wanted to see it through after months of watching her family targeted for something as small as a bicycle left in the driveway for an afternoon. Elena and I agreed, deciding she deserved to witness the resolution firsthand. Frank and Carol, now steadying the HOA board together, worked with the management company to overhaul the community's bylaws entirely, adding transparent voting requirements for any fines or citations, removing the vague, undocumented language Deborah had exploited for years without anyone formally challenging it. Walt continued organizing his files late into several evenings, preparing a clean, chronological summary for prosecutors that traced every dollar of the missing $40,000 back through the shell company, invoice by invoice, a document Ruiz later called the clearest paper trail I've seen in years. The prosecutor handling embezzlement, a sharp young attorney named Priya Anand, coincidentally sharing a name with the clerk who'd first flagged the abandoned vehicle filing, told us privately that Deborah's own signature appeared on every fraudulent withdrawal, leaving almost no room for a credible defense. Deborah's attorney attempted a plea negotiation weeks before trial, hoping to reduce the embezzlement charges in exchange for a guilty plea on the lesser obstruction count alone. Prosecutors declined, citing the strength of the documented evidence and the community impact of years of financial deception. News of the declined plea spread through Cedar Hollow, and for the first time in months, the neighborhood group chat carried something close to relief rather than anxiety, a shared sense that this wasn't going to quietly disappear the way so many of Deborah's past disputes always had. Tyler, having already accepted his own plea deal, was expected to testify against his mother regarding the arson attempt and the timeline of the hit-and-run cover-up, a decision his attorney framed as cooperation but that clearly weighed on him heavily in the weeks beforehand. Ruiz mentioned that Tyler had grown visibly withdrawn during his final interview sessions, admitting at one point that he'd gone along with the cover-up because he was afraid of his mother's reaction more than afraid of the actual consequences of the accident itself. That detail stuck with me longer than I expected. For all her manufactured authority over Cedar Hollow, Deborah had apparently ruled her own household the same way, through fear and control rather than trust. And her son had absorbed that lesson far more deeply than she probably realized. Elena pointed out that this didn't excuse what Tyler had done. The injured cyclist, the fabricated story, the gasoline container outside our garage. But it did explain, in an uncomfortable way, how deeply Deborah's need for control had shaped everyone unlucky enough to orbit closely around her. As the trial date approached, Carol organized a small neighborhood dinner, half celebration, half nervous energy release, where residents traded stories, openly for the first time about years of quiet compliance with Deborah's arbitrary rules, stories that had never surfaced together in one room before. Frank admitted he'd suspected something was wrong with the finances nearly 2 years earlier, but hadn't pursued it, afraid of becoming Deborah's next target the way so many others had. "I regret waiting," he said. "But I'm glad someone finally didn't wait any longer." I told him there was no use dwelling on the delay, that what mattered now was the clean, documented case moving forward, one strong enough that Deborah couldn't talk, threaten, or find her way out of it the way she'd managed every smaller conflict before this one. Walt, characteristically modest, brushed off any praise for his role, insisting the real turning point was the morning Reyes and Dabrowski showed up on my lawn and simply checked the paperwork instead of assuming it was valid. The moment Deborah's authority first cracked publicly. "Most people don't check," Walt said. "They just comply, because checking feels like more trouble than it's worth." She counted on that every single time, for 3 straight years, until she ran into someone whose whole career was built on checking exactly that kind of thing. Reyes, hearing that secondhand, laughed and said she'd simply been trained well, though she admitted the surreal moment of recognizing her own chief standing in a bathrobe on a residential lawn was something she'd probably tell at every retirement party for the rest of her career. The department itself had taken quiet interest in the case as it unfolded. Not because I'd asked for special attention, but because the arson attempt and the eventual arrest had understandably made waves internally. Several officers privately telling me they were relieved the situation resolved the way it had. My own captain pulled me aside one afternoon, half joking, asking if I'd deliberately staged the whole thing as some kind of community outreach exercise. I told him, honestly, that I'd spent most of those months simply hoping it wouldn't escalate as far as it eventually did. Sophie's notebook, the one she'd started keeping months earlier documenting Tyler's odd comments near the pool and mailboxes, ended up being formally entered as supporting evidence. Her careful, dated entries lining up precisely with the broader timeline Ruiz and Renata had built for the case. I didn't think it would actually matter, Sophie told the prosecutor during a preparation meeting, sounding almost embarrassed by how seriously her small notebook was being treated. Priya assured her that consistent, contemporaneous documentation from any witness carried real weight in court, regardless of the witness's age. Elena, watching Sophie handle the preparation meetings with more composure than either of us expected, admitted quietly that some good, strange as it felt to say, had come from all of it, watching our daughter learn to stand firm under pressure rather than shrink from it. The neighborhood itself had visibly changed by then too. Residents attending HOA meetings in numbers nobody could remember seeing before, asking questions, reviewing budgets line by line. The passive compliance that had let Deborah operate unchecked for years replaced by something closer to real vigilance. Carol summed it up best at that same neighborhood dinner, raising a glass of lemonade instead of anything stronger, saying simply that Cedar Hollow had finally remembered it was allowed to ask questions. A small sentence that got a longer, quieter round of applause than anyone expected. 2 nights before the trial began, I found myself in the garage, running a hand along the Mustang's fender the same way Deborah once had uninvited, thinking about how something as small as a car parked too long in a driveway had unraveled this much altogether. The trial opened on a gray Tuesday morning, the county courthouse fuller than usual, half of Cedar Hollow apparently having decided to attend in person rather than wait for updates through the group chat that had carried them through the entire ordeal for months. Priya Anand opened for the prosecution methodically, laying out the shell company, the $40,000 shortfall, the fraudulent lien, and the obstruction charge tied to Tyler's cover story, presenting each piece not as accusation but as simple, documented, undeniable fact for the jury to weigh. Deborah's attorney countered by attempting to frame the entire case as a personal vendetta, suggesting I had used my position as police chief to pressure witnesses and manufacture a case against a woman simply trying to enforce reasonable community standards in good faith. Priya calmly reminded the jury that the doorbell footage predated any public knowledge of my job title, that Reyes and Dabrowski had responded to a routine dispatch call with no idea whose house they were arriving at, and that the financial records existed independent of any personal grievance. Walt took the stand mid-morning, walking the jury through his cross-referenced invoices with the same measured patience he'd once used explaining evidence. In decades of real homicide trials, his credibility as a retired detective lending weight the defense struggled visibly to undercut in cross-examination. When the defense attorney suggested Walt might have fabricated invoice discrepancies out of personal dislike for Deborah, Walt simply replied that numbers don't hold grudges. and that every figure he'd cited matched documents the county itself had independently verified through its own separate audit process. Frank testified next, describing the shell company invoice he'd stumbled onto independently, and the emergency board meeting where Deborah had been suspended for votes to 1. Her own vote the sole dissent, a detail that visibly unsettled several jurors as it was read aloud. Reyes took the stand that afternoon, recounting the morning on my lawn in careful, professional detail, confirming she'd checked the lien status through standard procedure and found it invalid before she ever learned who lived at the address, undercutting any claim of favoritism entirely. Dabrowski followed, admitting under gentle questioning that his instinctive salute had genuinely surprised even him, and that it hadn't influenced his professional judgment about the paperwork, which he'd have flagged as invalid regardless of whose driveway they'd happened to be standing in that morning. By the second day, Detective Ruiz testified about the arson attempt, walking the jury through the time-stamped, geotagged footage frame by frame, the gasoline container clearly visible, Tyler's face illuminated under the motion lights before he fled back toward his Camaro parked down the street. The footage played on the courtroom screen in silence, and several jurors visibly flinched at the moment the floodlights snapped on, catching Tyler mid-step with the container in hand, a piece of evidence far more damning than anything paperwork alone could have ever conveyed on its own. Deborah's attorney attempted to argue Tyler had simply been checking on his mother's ongoing dispute and happened to be carrying gasoline for an unrelated errand, an explanation so thin that even the judge raised an eyebrow before instructing the jury to weigh it as presented. Tyler testified on the third day, visibly shaken, admitting under oath that his mother had instructed him to fabricate the guardrail story after the hit and run, and that she'd separately suggested, in his words, making the problem with the Mustang disappear one way or another. That phrase, one way or another, landed heavily in the courtroom, prompting Priya to ask directly whether Tyler understood it as encouragement toward the arson attempt. Tyler paused a long moment before answering quietly that he'd taken it exactly that way, though his mother never said it outright. Deborah's attorney objected repeatedly, arguing the phrase was vague and open to interpretation, but the judge allowed the testimony to stand, noting the jury was capable of weighing ambiguous language within the broader, well-documented context of everything else already presented over the previous 2 days. During cross-examination, the defense pushed hard on Tyler's credibility, given his own plea deal and cooperation agreement, suggesting he had every incentive to shift blame toward his mother. Tyler simply repeated, calmly, that he was finally just telling the truth after months of covering for her. Sophie testified briefly on the fourth day, her notebook entered as evidence, describing Tyler's comment at the pool about the Mustang not being in your garage much longer, a statement made weeks before the attempted arson that established clear premeditation rather than sudden impulse. Priya used Sophie's testimony to argue the arson attempt wasn't an isolated moment of panic, but the culmination of a plan discussed openly enough that a 16-year-old had overheard and understood its implications well before any of the adults around her had taken it seriously. Deborah's attorney chose not to cross-examine Sophie extensively, likely wary of how it would appear to further question a teenager's careful, dated documentation in front of a jury already visibly sympathetic to a family that had been targeted for months over something as small as a bicycle. I testified last among the family, walking the jury through the citation history from the very beginning. Sophie's bicycle, the wash time violation, the fabricated bylaw, the county filing calling my registered vehicle abandoned, each piece building steadily toward the tow attempt on our front lawn. Priya asked me directly whether I'd used my position as chief to influence the outcome at any point. I told the jury plainly that I hadn't disclosed my job title until officers arrived that morning entirely by chance, and that every legal step afterward had gone through Renata and the courts, not my badge. The defense's cross-examination attempted to suggest that officers might have felt pressured to side with their superior regardless of the facts. I reminded the jury, calmly, that the lien had already been ruled improperly filed by an entirely separate judge weeks before officers arrived that morning. Renata testified afterward, laying out the timeline of the improper lien, the cease and desist ignored, and the eventual court ruling voiding it entirely, evidence that existed independent of my job title and would have unfolded identically regardless of who happened to own that Mustang. By the fifth day, the prosecution rested, having built a case spanning embezzlement, fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy to commit arson, each charge supported by documentation gathered not through any single dramatic confrontation, but through months of patient, careful, ordinary people simply refusing to look away. Deborah's attorney called only 2 witnesses in her defense. A former HOA vendor who vaguely described some landscaping work without concrete documentation, and a character witness who admitted under cross-examination she hadn't actually spoken to Deborah in over a year before the trial began. Deborah herself took the stand on the 6th day, composed at first, insisting the shell company had performed legitimate work she simply lacked proper documentation for, and that Tyler's actions were entirely his own, something she claimed she'd never encouraged or even known about in advance. Priya's cross-examination dismantled that claim methodically, walking Deborah through her own text messages, subpoenaed from Tyler's phone, showing her writing, "We need that car gone before anyone starts asking real questions." A message sent the same week the gasoline container appeared on our camera footage. Deborah's composure finally broke on the stand, her voice rising as she insisted the message meant something else entirely, that she'd only meant a legal sale, not violence, though she couldn't explain why "before anyone starts asking real questions" would apply to a simple, legitimate purchase offer. The courtroom sat in heavy silence as Priya read the message aloud a second time, slower, letting each word land fully before asking Deborah directly whether she'd ever once, in 3 years of citations and fines, actually cared about bylaws, or only about control. Deborah didn't answer that question. She sat back in the witness chair, jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere past the jury box, and for the first time in the entire trial, said nothing at all. The silence itself answering a question words apparently couldn't anymore. Closing arguments came the following morning, Priya walking the jury once more through every thread. The shell company, the fraudulent lien, the fabricated bylaws, the concealed hit and run, and the text message tying it all together into a single, cohesive pattern of control taken far too far. Deborah's attorney argued for leniency, describing his client as a devoted mother who made poor decisions under pressure. A framing that landed poorly given the jury had already spent 5 days watching that same devotion translate into fraud, cover-ups, and an attempted act of arson. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours, a relatively short window for a case spanning this many charges, returning with a verdict that afternoon as Cedar Hollow residents filled nearly every seat in the gallery, Carol and Frank sitting together near the front row. Guilty on all counts: embezzlement, fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit arson. Deborah's expression barely moved as the verdicts were read one after another, Though her attorney's shoulders visibly sank with each word, the jury foreperson spoke into the quiet courtroom. Behind me, I heard Carol exhale a breath she seemed to have been holding since the Nome incident years earlier. Elena reached over and took my hand. Sophie sat very still, watching Deborah closely, as if trying to memorize the exact moment accountability finally arrived. Sentencing was scheduled for several weeks later, giving prosecutors time to finalize restitution calculations covering both the missing HOA funds and Webb's ongoing medical expenses from the hit and run. Expenses Deborah's cover-up had left him shouldering alone for months longer than necessary. Tyler, having already pleaded and cooperated fully, received a lighter sentence than his mother: community service, probation, and mandatory restitution to Webb, a resolution Ruiz described as fair given his cooperation, though far from painless given what his testimony had cost his relationship with his mother. Deborah, facing the combined weight of embezzlement, fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy charges, received a sentence that included significant prison time, alongside full restitution to both the HOA and to Webb. A number Priya noted publicly was among the largest HOA-related judgments the county had seen. Walking out of the courthouse that final day, Reyes caught up with us on the steps, telling Sophie directly that her notebook had genuinely mattered, that careful, patient documentation from an ordinary witness had helped hold together a case far bigger than anyone initially realized. Sophie smiled for what felt like the first time in weeks, something lifting visibly off her shoulders as the reality of the verdict finally settled in fully. No longer an ongoing threat hanging over dinners and driveways, but a resolved chapter she'd helped bring to a close. Carol hugged Elena tightly on the courthouse steps, saying she finally felt like Cedar Hollow belonged to its residents again, rather than to whoever shouted the loudest at board meetings. A small, simple sentiment that captured something larger about the entire ordeal all at once. Frank mentioned that the HOA board, now fully reorganized under transparent bylaws, had already approved real landscaping work for the community entrance. Work Deborah's fraudulent invoices had claimed for years without ever actually happening. A small but visible sign of genuine change taking root. Walt, walking slowly beside me toward the parking lot, said this case reminded him why he'd loved detective work in the first place. Not the dramatic confrontations, but the quiet satisfaction of patient people building something true out of scattered, overlooked pieces of paper. You could have just pulled rank the whole time, he added. Showed the badge day one. Ended it in a week. I told him I didn't regret waiting, that letting the facts speak first meant nobody could ever say the outcome happened because of who I was. Elena squeezed my arm as we walked, saying quietly that watching the whole neighborhood learn to stand up together meant more than any faster resolution could have. That Cedar Hollow hadn't just gotten rid of Deborah. It had actually changed how it handled power altogether. Reyes and Dabrowski both stopped by the house that weekend, off duty, mostly just to see the Mustang up close after months of it being the center of a case that had somehow ended up defining half their year at the department in one strange, memorable stretch. Dabrowski laughed, running a hand along the fender the same way Deborah once had uninvited. Though this time I didn't mind at all, letting him admire it properly, telling him a little about my father's restoration work while Sophie brought out lemonade for everyone. Guess this car's earned its reputation twice over now, Reyes said, and I found myself agreeing, thinking about how something as small as a bicycle citation had eventually unraveled fraud, cover-ups, and an attempted arson, all traced back to one woman's need to control everything around her. Webb reached out separately that same week, thanking us for the support during the trial, saying the restitution finally covered his medical bills in full, and that he planned to keep riding his bike, unwilling to let one reckless night change how he lived his life. By the time the last of the paperwork settled, Cedar Hollow felt like a genuinely different place. Board meetings running on transparent votes instead of quiet compliance. Neighbors greeting each other in driveways without the old wariness that had quietly shaped the community for years under Deborah. Winter arrived softly that year, and for the first time in months, no citations appeared taped to our door. No tow trucks idled in our driveway. No gasoline containers showed up on security footage in the middle of the night. Just an ordinary, quiet, uneventful season. Sophie kept her notebook, oddly enough, saying she'd started using it for school projects instead, joking that documenting things carefully turned out to be a useful habit far beyond HOA disputes. A small silver lining neither of us had expected to come from all of it. Deborah's old house sold to a young family that spring, the new owners unaware, first, of everything that house had quietly witnessed, until Carol, welcoming them warmly with a plate of cookies, gently mentioned the neighborhood's rebuilt bylaws and exactly why they now existed at all. Occasionally I still washed the Mustang slowly on Saturday mornings. The same routine that had started this entire chain of events. Though it felt different now. Less like a target sitting exposed in a driveway. More like a quiet, hard-earned symbol of everything that had held firm. Renata told me once, over coffee, that she'd handled plenty of HOA disputes over her career, but never one that unraveled quite this far beneath the surface, calling it proof that even the smallest, pettiest conflicts sometimes hide something far larger waiting patiently to be uncovered. Walt still stops by most weekends, coffee in hand, and we don't talk about the case much anymore. Mostly just the weather, the neighborhood, Sophie's grades. Ordinary conversations that feel earned after a year that started with a bicycle and ended in a courtroom verdict. Elena says the whole ordeal taught her something simple she still reminds Sophie of often. That quiet people who keep careful records, who stay patient instead of panicked, usually end up holding more power in the end than the loudest voice in any room ever really does. As for the Mustang, it still sits in the garage most days, covered, waiting, cherry red beneath the tarp. No longer just my father's legacy but a small reminder that some things, and some people, are worth standing firm for, no matter how long the fight takes. The END.